Good evening. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Catherine Magana, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with the student program or student worker after the program. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. We have a loop hearing section at each program designated by a sign as well as a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of the student workers or our staff members. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, I'd like to introduce Associate Director and Director of Museum and Archives, Audrey Coleman, who will provide the program introduction for this series from the stage.
Thank you, Catherine. Welcome, everyone, to the Dole Institute and our inaugural presidential lecture series, our first installment this year for in spring 2020. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me all right? All right, that's better. A little amplification. Again, welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here. I want to extend some special thanks before we get underway to KU's Departments of Communication Studies, the Department of History, and the Department of Political Science for their co-sponsorship of this year's presidential lecture series. I also wanted to recognize a guest in the audience, a special guest. Mr. Ron Marks is our Dole Fellow this spring 2020. Ron, would you stand up and say hi to everyone? Ron is leading and coordinating our 7-part discussion group series that begins next Wednesday at 4:00 p.m. here at the Dole Institute, and the topic is Spying in the Cyber Age. It's going to be a fascinating series of discussions, and you won't want to miss it. Ron himself is a 35-year-old. Are you 35-year-old? You're welcome. It won't happen again. A 35-year veteran of the intelligence community, a former senior analyst for the CIA, and also former intelligence counsel to Senate Majority Leaders Bob Dole and Trent Lott. So join us for those conversations beginning next Wednesday. He's got a great series of guests, and he'll be our host for those sessions. Thank you, Ron. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Rowland, who's an award-winning scholar and professor of communication studies here at KU and is the creator and coordinator of this year's presidential lecture series. Dr. Rowland is an expert on rhetorical criticism, argumentation, and the public sphere. And among his many accomplishments, he delivered the keynote lecture at the Reagan Centennial Celebration at the University of Southern California in 2011. Welcome, Professor Rowland.
Thank you very much.
Would you please introduce our esteemed panelists and colleagues of yours?
Did you notice we got feedback as soon as my name was mentioned? But that's not a sign about this, because this program in 3 different ways, I'd say that this is kind of the Patrick Mahomes level of what KU. First, the Dole Institute is at the Patrick Mahomes level. And we're going to talk about great presidential speeches, touchdowns every time. And my problem in the introduction of Mary Stuckey and David Zarefsky is if I go through all their qualifications, I'll then be saying good night, because that's all we have time for. So let me very briefly say a few words about, and by the way, they're both distinguished scholars for the National Communication Association. Mary Stuckey is a professor, soon to be a distinguished professor, a named professor at Penn State, the author of dozens of articles and important books, and the only person in rhetorical studies to be the editor of the 2 most prestigious journals focused on rhetoric ever. Mary Stuckey. David Rev Ski is an emeritus professor from Northwestern, a distinguished debate champion. He has an expert in argumentation, debate, rhetoric, a major scholar about Lincoln and LBJ, the winner of many, many research and teaching awards. And he taught me one of my first classes as an MA at Northwestern a long time ago. David Rev.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, David and Mary, for being with us this evening. This is going to be really fun. So, 5 great presidential speeches. Let's start at the beginning. What makes a presidential speech great?
Yeah. If only there was an easy answer to that. I'm going to start with that because I think 2 things make it great. A certain level of eloquence is always nice, and eloquence is this wonderful thing that's super hard to define and depends on the age, right? So an eloquent speech is one that can speak to its own times in the language of its times. We wouldn't necessarily sit still for a Daniel Webster speech now, although if we're going to talk about a tweeting presidency, maybe some of us yearn for a Daniel Webster speech, or at least a paragraph. Right, so a good presidential speech would have a paragraph. Let me start there. And I also think it has to have some kind of impact. The speeches I chose for tonight were speeches, the 2 that I have, were both given to Congress, and both of them set out both aspirational aims and followed it up with actual policy incentives or programs. And so I want to say that there's something about follow-through that matters as well.
I'd like to pick up on that comment about eloquence and say that a great speech does really 2 things. The first is that it speaks to the exigencies of its time, as Mary said. The second is that it outlasts the exigencies of its time so that it can be read or heard or seen with profit once the specific context of its time has been changed and a new generation or a new audience comes to the fore.
And unsurprisingly, I agree with my colleagues, but let me add 2 things. I think great speeches, speeches that continue to live, are almost always about ideas about what the American experiment with democracy means. And Ronald Reagan, paraphrasing James Madison, talked about, we are a nation of, an empire of ideals. And I think one thing is that it reflects on those kinds of ideals, and I think all the speeches we're talking about tonight do that. And I think great speeches also tend to talk about what it means to be an American. And we are not there yet, but over time, that definition of what it means to be an American has gradually become more and more inclusive as we've recognized our shared humanity. I understand that's it may seem difficult to believe that tonight, but I still think those 2 things, they're of course right, about eloquence and living beyond our times. Exactly right.
All right, well, the task is at hand. Let's charge into it. 5 great presidential speeches. Professor Rev Ski, yours is one of the earliest and oldest speeches that we'll be discussing this evening, and you have called this speech an interesting and imaginative response to a historical situation. What was the situation, what was the speech, and what makes it great?
Well, before I answer those questions, since I'm in the unusual position of going first rather than in alphabetical order, I want to make 2 quick observations. One is you'll notice that most of the speeches that we have chosen are of relatively recent vintage. In fact, we don't go back farther than the one I'm going to talk about in a minute, Lincoln's second inaugural. That's not because we have no historical interests, I assure you. It's because the custom of presidents frequently and routinely giving speeches is of the last 125 years by and large. Abraham Lincoln gave under 100 speeches during the entire time he was president, and most of those were welcoming addresses to visiting delegations. Even as relatively undistinguished rhetorically, a recent president as Gerald Ford, whom you will know as Bob Dole's running mate, Gerald Ford would sometimes give 100 speeches in a month. So the practice of presidential speech making is in large part of recent origin. Second, you'll notice that a number of the speeches that we've picked are inaugural addresses, including this one. And that, I think, is partly because the inaugural is a somewhat distinct genre or category of speeches. With few exceptions, incoming presidents have followed Thomas Jefferson's example in his first inaugural and have given speeches that are lofty in tone, unifying in purpose, broadly suggestive of directions to be pursued during the administration without being too specific, asking for help and support from the American people, and asking divine blessing as well. Well, I picked Lincoln's second inaugural because it's given in a very delicate moment. The Civil War is not yet over. It's clear that the South will not win militarily. It's not clear that the South will surrender, as opposed to going to the hills and taking up guerrilla warfare. Lincoln needs to speak to a known but yet uncertain context. He also needs to give some idea of what's going to follow the war, what are his ideas for Reconstruction. And indeed, he was criticized after giving this speech for not being specific enough about Reconstruction. But he sets that all up by putting the whole experience of the war in a larger and unifying context as divine punishment visited on both the North and the South. And he walks a very delicate line between blaming the South for the war and universalizing blame for the war. You can read the speech as doing either of those things. And it continues to speak to us because of this context-shifting nature of the speech. And it's very short. The entire speech is 4 paragraphs long, 701 words. It's the shortest inaugural in history with the exception of George Washington's second. It is the most intertwining of politics and religion, I think, of any presidential inaugural address, and yet its appeals to religion are unifying and not divisive. Let me stop there, but those are the reasons that I would nominate that speech.
Robin, Mary, do you have anything to add or anything you would?
It's such an artful use of religion, right? I mean, he starts with a sort of Old Testament, very harsh kind of, this has been visited upon us, and ends with such a lovely grace note, a sort of New Testament understanding of forgiveness, and it's just a lovely speech.
I think this speech, well, first, if you've been to the Lincoln Memorial and you read it, I've only been a few times, but I've cried every single time, because it's an expression of the larger sense that we're all Americans. And I think the final words, when he talks about with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and he goes on. He's not talking to North and South. He's talking to this idea of Americans who will go on and be together. And you think of how many times that we fight bitter wars someplace in the world, and we hate each other for decade after decade after decade, or you look at the Islamic world, century after century. You look at the battles between Protestants and Catholics, the idiocy of that, and you hear Lincoln saying, but we're all Americans, and we stand for something larger. We've not lived up to Lincoln, and we've not come close, but what an incredible example, what an ideal to aim at. We're a long way from that, but the words still, I cry every time.
Moving into the 20th century, a very different era and a nation contemplating war instead of reconciliation, perhaps. Dr. Stuckey, would you tell us?
Yeah, so I picked Roosevelt's For Freedom speech, and he says, As men do not live by bread alone, they do not fight by armaments alone. Those who man our defenses and those behind them who build our defenses must have the stamina and the courage which come from unshakable belief in the manner of life which they are defending. And so he says about that unshakable belief, there's nothing mysterious about the foundations of a healthy and strong democracy. The basic things expected by our people of their political and economic systems are simple. They are equality of opportunity for youth and for others, jobs for those who can work, security for those who need it, the ending of the special privilege for the few, the preservation of civil liberty for all, the enjoyment of the fruits of scientific progress in a wider and constantly rising standard of living. And he then says that there are 4 freedoms associated with this. The first is the freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms mean a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. And so what he does there is he takes the American ideal and tries to make the best of that available to everyone in the world. And it is clearly a follow-on of Woodrow Wilson's, the war that will make the world safe for democracy. But it has with that very specific goals as to what that world would look like. So at the end, people know what they're fighting for, and at the end, of course, of this, his dream is the United Nations as a way to make that happen.
And this is at the end, he's addressing Congress.
He's addressing Congress. This is actually an annual message to the State of the Union. It's January 6th, 1941.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's in that moment.
And what is his policy? So he sets out this vision for America and the world. And how does it relate to the policy that he's asking for?
Well, what he's envisioning, right? There is a world war already happening. It's not quite embroiled the United States yet. And his goal is that if there's going to be war, as he clearly thinks that it's going to be long, it's going to be difficult. The whole first part of this speech, he's addressing, he attacks appeasers and isolationists. He is still making arguments for the necessity of war. And he's promising at the end of it that the American ideal will be that which dominates the Western world, I think.
One of the remarkable things about this speech is it's given at a time when public opinion is still somewhat divided. I mean, it's moving in the direction of supporting our involvement in the war, but it's certainly not there yet. And those early references to isolationists and appeasers are not straw man arguments. So
He says we are soft-hearted, but we cannot afford to be soft-headed.
I think one of the remarkable things about it is he clearly anticipates what's going to happen. And the speech is designed, I think in part, to move the American public in the direction that he sees it going to go and needing to go.
And he's giving them a reason to fight, right? We need to get into the war to defend these principles that are foundational to ourselves.
I'm struck by kind of the short-term message about the need to rearmament that he's discussing there, and the long-term message about the evolving nature of democracy. In the short term, and we've heard about how there is opposition to American involvement in the war, but one thing I'm really struck by is how he says we should not demand immediate repayment from, at this point, this is 1940, we're going to be rearming, we're going to be helping the Brits in particular. This is 10 months roughly before Pearl Harbor. And you just think about that as opposed to a time today where all we want is instant repayment for what we do. He was willing to invest in international institutions to keep to make the peace and then keep the peace. But it also strikes me that this is a speech about his evolving understanding of what a truly successful democratic society would provide and how it will take care of its citizens. This nation began in opposition to tyranny, and we had experienced the British Crown, et cetera. And so much of the early definition of democracy was negative, of what we would not allow in order to protect our freedoms. But Roosevelt, it seems to me, recognizes freedom from want, freedom from fear, that to truly protect all our freedoms, we need to have a society where there is a sense of solidarity among all of us. And to do that, we need to make sure that the least of us have a way to make our way in the world. When Mayor, I wish I'd chosen it, Mary. You chose a fabulous example of a speech that really this speech kind of sets the stage for an awful lot that is to come, but not said as eloquently as FDR. But it's like saying, if you're not as eloquent as Lincoln or FDR, that could still be okay.
The other thing that's worth mentioning about this speech is it fits together with one that he gave just a week earlier, addressed to the American people, when he called on the U.S. to become the great arsenal of democracy and proposed the Lend-Lease program. And it's as if this speech takes the specifics from that one and sets them into a broader and more idealistic context.
And he says, this is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our time and our generation. The kind of world is a very antithesis of the so-called new order of tyranny which the dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb. To that new order, we oppose a greater conception, a moral order. A good society is able to face schemes of world domination and foreign revolutions alike without fear.
Sounds pretty contemporary, doesn't it? And if I can interject, great rhetoricians are also really, really competent oftentimes. Franklin Delano Roosevelt promoted George C. Marshall to be chief of staff, and it was like over 100 and some people who are more senior than him. Good rhetoric and good policy often go together. Now you can draw your own.
Not always.
Not always. You can draw your own inference on what the opposite of that might be.
Okay. All right, fascinating discussion. So our next pick is 20 years or more into the future, and instead of facing World War II, we're in the midst of the Cold War. David, would you tell us more about your second choice?
Sure. In 1999, a group of about 150 scholars of public discourse ranked the top 100 speeches of the 20th century, American speeches.
Only one State of the Union made it, and it was the For Freedom speech. Sorry.
The number 2 ranking was Kennedy's inaugural address. It was behind only Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. I did not pick Kennedy's inaugural address for the reason that I don't think it meets the test of speaking beyond its time to the degree that one would expect of a great speech. It is a wonderful representative example of American rhetoric in the middle of the Cold War and under the pressures of the Cold War. Instead, the speech that I chose was the commencement address that Kennedy gave at American University in June of 1963, which is the first example that I can find of an American president from the mid-20th century beginning to look beyond the Cold War. And the speech emphasizes peace as the most significant term, where previous rhetoric had tended to emphasize freedom as the most significant term. And the argument that the speech makes is that in the world after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we can't afford to continue with an arms race. We can't afford to assume we will not miscalculate and get into war. And we need to begin to focus on peace as our ultimate objective. And so he's rethinking the assumptions of the Cold War. He's asking Americans to begin to rethink their assumptions about the Soviet Union, and he distinguishes Russia as a world power, or the USSR as a world power, from communism as an ideological system, and says we have to get beyond ideological difference. And he paraphrased Woodrow Wilson, saying if we cannot now end our differences, we can at least make the world safe for diversity. And then goes on to say, you know, we need to think about what all human beings have in common. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Now, Kennedy is not making a conversion in this speech. In fact, 2 weeks later, he goes to Berlin, and facing the wall, he says, there are some who say we can get along with the communists, let them come to Berlin. And in September, he would say he believes in the domino theory, and we have to stand firm in Vietnam. But this speech opens a window, and it gets beyond where public opinion is and urges the American public to at least open their eyes to the possibility of thinking in a new direction and changing course. And it's a very courageous act to give that kind of a speech without public backing for it, and to ask the public to begin to rethink. And that's the reason I picked this one.
And that's such an interesting point, I think, David, because Roosevelt once said, it's such a terrible thing to start leading and look behind you and find nobody there, right? And so the issue of how does a president lead public opinion, but not lead it so much that he leaves public opinion behind and thus fails, right? So Roosevelt gives a famous speech called the Quarantine Speech.
Right.
Right? And he looks behind him and there's nobody
Nobody's
there.
there.
And so he's like, okay, well, so maybe the whole global leadership thing is not happening. And he waits, you know, quite a long time before he tries that again.
And goes at it very slowly.
Right? And as he tries to get, and of course events help, right? So if the Nazis had done fewer terrible things, it would have been harder for Roosevelt to make the argument. But in this case, what Kennedy's really trying to do is, as you said, open that window. And so giving people the chance to see a thing, but that kind of persuasion requires an enormous amount of time and commitment, and it builds on itself. And presidents don't have that kind of time, right? A senator like Bob Dole can be around for a long time in the Senate. Best case, presidents have 8 years, which is not a whole lot of time to make a complicated case and hope that public opinion will follow it. So it's an enormously courageous speech.
Lincoln had a statement somewhat like this, in which he encouraged people to begin thinking about emancipation even while he was saying he supported colonization. But it was a written message to Congress, not a speech, so I couldn't pick it.
I'm struck by how contemporary this speech is in making the point that we are stronger when our allies are those nations that share our ideals, and
Right.
how it's crucial for us to stand together.
Robin, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you hold your mic just to your mouth? or
ever
something?
told me I'm
I
not
wanna-
talking.
I want everybody to hear the
No one's
the
ever
greatness.
told me I'm not talking loud enough before. I was saying that I think the speech is contemporary because it points to the importance of having allies based on our ideals and their ideals, and not just on self-interest. And let me add that 8 years is the best case or the worst case, depending upon the circumstance.
Can we pause a minute and talk a little bit? I mean, you're talking about public opinion and making sure that people are behind you when you're talking. What difference do the media environments in those three, you know, Lincoln, can you talk about that, and how did people learn about what the president said and get access to that information, and is that significant?
Well, the media environment that Lincoln faced was highly polarized. I mean, the notion of objectivity, even as an ideal, didn't yet exist. So the press was highly partisan. Now, by the time he gives the second inaugural, the press is divided in a little bit different way. There's supportive press, and then there's more radical press saying he's not going far enough. but the speeches were widely disseminated. The press really begins to play a very important role in the 1850s, when the combination of the railroad and the telegraph begin really to knit the country together in a way that had not been before.
And Roosevelt has the genius to understand that he has a medium that gets into every American home or every American town, right? And so you always see these pictures of people leaning forward. And one of my students, when I took him to the FDR library, was like, oh, look, they're like listening intently. And I said, they have to, the reception's terrible, right? And so literally the radio becomes part of the family circle. For the first time on a routine basis, and partly because Roosevelt's around for so long, the president's voice is literally in your home in a way that had not been, I mean, it had happened before, but not with the regularity that Roosevelt did. And he was very careful about when he spoke, how often he spoke, what he spoke about when he was on the radio, so that his words would have a certain kind of authority, portentousness, and weight. So he was very strategic about using that medium. And then when we get to some of these later presidents, they don't have that kind of choice to be strategic. You know, you mentioned how often Gerald Ford spoke, and partly that's because he gets catapulted into a campaign.
Right.
But it's also because the expectation that if anything happens, the president will be there to tell us what it means. That it's not true unless the president has a speaking voice. And now that's gone, right? There's so many competing kinds of information that the presidential voice doesn't have the same ability to cut through that noise.
Kennedy cultivated the press, and as a result, he generally got pretty favorable press coverage, and the press was deferential to him. And we now know that there are many things that the press knew about and chose not to cover and report. But any kind of speech that he gave was seen as a major address that got a lot of press coverage.
So even at a university, he would have had plenty of press coverage to would
Yes.
have suffered on account of
Yes.
that.
And, you know, most commencement addresses are full of platitudes directed to the graduates, but sometimes when a public figure delivers the address, it becomes a venue for a major policy proposal, most notably George Marshall at Harvard proposing what became known as the Marshall Plan. And Kennedy's commencement address at American University was in that category.
Okay, we've chosen 3 out of the 5. What are the last 2 going to be? Professor Stuckey.
Oh, now we're on to Lyndon Johnson. So in 1965, a bunch of civil rights marchers try to march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama. They are stopped by police, sheriffs, and bystanders, brutally beaten. And the president gives a special message to Congress a few days later. And he opens that address by saying, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy." So these are pretty high stakes. And what Johnson does in this speech is he is the first American president to put the weight of the presidency behind the cause of civil rights. And at the end of this speech, when he says, you know, we're going to do this and, you know, we shall overcome, he puts the civil rights movement in the heart of the presidency. And so he unites the significance of what's happening with civil rights with the power of the presidency in a way that had not been done before. And it's remarkable. So he says in this speech, he asks the American people to join him in this cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. So he literally puts the cause the civil rights people are fighting for as they cross that bridge in Selma on the same moral plane with Appomattox and Lexington and Concord, right, which is an enormous thing in 1965. And he says, where's the other thing I wanted to say? The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is one rarely are we met with a challenge not to our growth or abundance, our welfare or our security, but to the values and purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, should we double our wealth and conquer the stars and still be unequal to this issue, we will have failed as a people and as a nation. There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. Right? And this is an enormously important moment in the history of civil rights, I would argue, in the history of the presidency and in the history of our country.
It seems to me this speech speaks to that point I made much earlier, that great speeches talk about American identity. And here, this speech makes the point that American identity transcends race. And let me add that there's an echo of this speech in Obama's second inaugural, when he talks about how the American journey that goes from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall is broadening on the message that LBJ said with great eloquence. And that's a journey that is not yet complete, but is perhaps, hopefully, still at the core of the American experience. This is, rereading this speech, it brings tears to your eyes.
Oh, yeah, sorry. The other thing he does here that is, I think, enormously important is he says it's not just Negroes, but it's all of us who have to overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are, right? And then he does this beautiful riff on his identity, American identity, and the need for inclusiveness in that it's a remarkable speech.
In Obama's 2004 keynote, at one point he talks about that if there is someone on the south side of Chicago, a grandparent who does not have food, it matters to him if it's not his grandparent. Obama is echoing what LBJ said at this time. And that, again, is a point that these are not black or white or whatever. These are American ideas. This is an unbelievable speech.
And I want to, just one last point, sorry, is he doesn't just mobilize American ideology, but he also mobilizes what at that moment is the great respect the American people have for the institution of the presidency. He says at one point, your president makes this request of every American, right? I want you to join. And so he's really mobilizing the faith that that Americans have in 1965 in their political institutions. Everybody stop and remember, we once had faith in our political institutions, and we could mobilize that faith in deeply significant ways.
There's a line in this speech that is sometimes misunderstood when Johnson says there is no moral issue. This sounds like a contrast to Kennedy's civil rights message that he gave the day after the American University speech when he said we're confronted primarily with a moral issue. The reason Johnson says there's no moral issue is not that he's amoral. It's that the issue has already been decided. There's no need for more argument about it. And so this speech becomes not a justification for action on voting rights, but an attempt at mobilization for an argument that has already been concluded.
Mm-hmm. And so he's going to echo Lincoln, and he gets echoed later. So there is this sense that the presidency is this importantly self-referential institution, right? That it has this centrality within the American imagination that he can say, for instance, God will not favor everything we do, right? Which is a clear echo of Lincoln. It is our duty to divine his will, but I cannot help believing that he truly understands and that he really favors the undertaking that we begin here tonight, right? And he's clearly echoing Lincoln there in the same way that Obama is going to pick up on this. And so there is this notion of the presidency and history being so deeply embedded in one another that is part of what makes a speech eloquent.
Fascinating. President Reagan is known as a great orator, Professor Rowland. How could you pick just one speech of his for our last number 5?
Well, I could never pick just one speech, but I had to. But before I talk about his speech at the Palace of Westminster on June 8th of 1982, let me tell you that I first started studying President Reagan almost 40 years ago, and I bought into all the stereotypes of the time that he was an extremist and just a movie actor, and I came to discover that all of those stereotypes were wrong. That he was actually a gifted speechwriter, his own best speechwriter, much more pragmatic than has been realized, and had a genuine sense of what it means to be an American, and that stood for something, the democratic ideal. The speech he gave at Westminster was at the very height of the Cold War. People are afraid of Reagan. There are massive marches going on in both the United States and Europe. People fear that he is just a cowboy movie actor, either dumb enough or radical enough to get us into a war. And what he does at Westminster is give an outline of his Soviet policy. But in another way, what he did was give us a rhetorical theory of the Cold War. Now, I draw on, in my analysis, Professor Zaretsky's work on definition. And I argue that definition is powerful because it gives us a worldview. And in Obama's case, in Reagan's case, he gives us an ideology. And that ideology is that democracy is an idea that actually works. But he ties that idea to a narrative. And he begins that narrative in a passage that he wrote himself. He talks about beginning with the Exodus, so that's a while back. And he talks about it as an idea that moves toward the idea that personal freedom is relevant for all human beings. And he ties that to a set of values. And he says at that point that democracy is not only the most moral system of government, he says democracy is not a fragile flower, still it needs nurturing. And in the speech, he lays out his theory of the Cold War, which was to call the Soviet Union what it was, a brutal tyranny, and to point out that it was a brutal tyranny that couldn't feed its own people. That irritated the Soviets a great deal, which was his goal. It also was true. And people in the Soviet Union, and especially in the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe, knew it was true. He had a buildup of weapons, and that was largely rhetorical in nature because Reagan was very averse to actually using weapons. It was sending the message that you cannot keep up with our economy, but he also offered real arms control. When he said that in the 80s, conservatives thought he was kidding and hoped he was kidding, and liberals were terrified that he didn't mean it. When he actually did mean it, it surprised both groups, to the great joy of liberals and to the great unhappiness of the neoconservatives of the era. But then most of all, he defended the idea of democracy. And he argued that in the whole arc of human history, that no one wants to live in a society in which you don't have some say. No one wants to live in a society when you can't trust the free press, etc. And it turned out that combination of ideas, a consistent narrative, a consistent set of values, a consistent argument, 9 years later, the Soviet Union is gone. Now, I'm not saying Reagan did that. The most important people in that would be Truman, Atchison, and Marshall, and Gorbachev. But Reagan's idea that our system works better than your system, and why don't you join us in that? That idea was really powerful. Now, there's one more thing I want to say about this speech, and I want to quote just one phrase, because when you go through this speech, the first draft is terrible. Anthony Dolan writes a radical draft, and it's a good draft, but it is word-heavy. It needs major cuts. And then you look at Reagan's cuts, and he edits or rewrites more than half of the speech. And when you read that, you cannot think that Reagan is just an actor. Today, I want to read you just one line that I think gives you a sense of Reagan's argument and his narrative, and it also shows you what a great writer Reagan was. He said, "Today on the NATO line, our military forces face east to prevent possible invasion. On the other side of the line, the Soviet forces also face east to prevent their people from leaving." And of course, just 7 years later, that actually happened as their forces let the people leave from East Germany, from Czechoslovakia, and so on and so forth. It's a speech that made a real difference, and I see it in kind of a line with Kennedy and then the four freedoms before it, that the most important aspect of American foreign policy is our ideas, and our ideas are our most powerful weapons.
Here we have it. You've got a trick up your sleeve, Dr. Rowland. You've picked another speech.
He cheated.
He cheated. With another speech with a Kansas connection.
Well,
directly.
I'm an old debater. It struck me that going last was also a good idea. But I said we'd have a bonus speech, and you would, the sixth speech, but it's not really quite in the same category as the other speeches. It's the greatest speech in the last 100 years by a president in the state of Kansas. Now, I also kind of cheated because that's not the largest group of important speeches by presidents in the state of Kansas that you'll ever find. But the other advantage of this is that I get to talk about President Obama. And President Obama went to Osawatomie 101 years after Teddy Roosevelt presented the new nationalism in Osawatomie. Every 101 years, Osawatomie becomes the center of presidential rhetoric. So we've got 90-some years to go. And he was in a very difficult point. The economy had not come back. And more importantly than that, he had found himself in a rhetorical box. I think you could say to some extent of his own making. You remember when he promised, he said our politics are not as divided as they would appear, and he promised to bring us hope and change. And then he became president and discovered, at least in Washington, our politics are every bit as divided as they would appear. I don't think that's true of average citizens, but in Washington it was true. Let me just give you one example of that. The Republicans in Congress favored a stimulus program in the spring of 2008 because the economy was in bad shape. By the time Obama becomes president and the economy has collapsed, they have become fervent supporters of cutting the national debt, and only 3 Republicans in Congress, one who then became a Democrat, supported any kind of stimulus. Now, let me remind you, after 7 years of growth, that we then had a tax cut in the first year of the Trump presidency. So the point I'm making is it's a highly partisan time. Think about what happened when Republicans would oppose Obama. They would say he promised to bring us together. Look, I'm voting against him, so he hasn't brought us together. Now, this was a difficult time. Obama realized that he needed to change the narrative, and of all places, he went to Osawatomie because that's where TR spoke. And what he said was that the real problem we faced in this country was that we did not give opportunity to all our fellow citizens. The signature line is, he said, everybody needed to do their fair share, and we needed to give everybody a fair shot. And so income inequality and the rich and others who wouldn't do their fair share for the rest of us, I'm a KU faculty member, I'm not in the rich, obviously, that was the core theme, and that theme carried him to re-election. Now, admittedly, with that theme, running against somebody who'd been an investment banker was kind of a rhetorical gift as well. But it seems to me that what Obama then did was shift the narrative. And by the way, let me also say to those who argue that no one had talked about income inequality before Senator Sanders, they should listen to what President Obama said when he went to Osawatomie and gave the greatest speech in 100 years in Kansas. Presidential speech in Kansas. Bill Self's given better speeches, but it's a specialized setting.
So I just want to pick up on one of the themes that Robin mentioned there, which is that presidents are storytellers. They tell us the story of our country, they tell us the story of our history, they tell us the story of our time. And to the extent that they do that well and it resonates with us, we consider them eloquent. And to the extent that they can tell small stories of our time and place them in larger narratives, then they're getting to that notion of timelessness, right?
And to state the obvious, the narratives are not given. The president invents the narrative. I mean, it has to meet a certain level of reality testing, but it's not automatic what the narrative will be or how the president will choose to deploy it. So this narrative of Obama's at Osawatomie is also threading what's emerging as threading a needle of what's emerging as a split within the Democratic Party that is talked about today as the centrists and the progressives. And Obama is signaling in a progressive direction, getting ready for his re-election campaign, it seems to me.
And it wasn't a given that LBJ would tie Selma to Appomattox and Lexington and Concord, right? I mean, that's...
Thank you. Did I lose my mic? Can you hear me? Nope.
Robin, hand me that.
Thank you, all three of you, for this wonderful discussion. And fortunately, it's time to turn it over to the audience and audience questions. We have a couple of students with microphones roving around. If you have a question, please raise your hand and one of them will come to you. There in the back, Camilla, it looks like.
Thank you. Each of you mentioned unifying as a particularly important attribute of great speeches. What are the conditions under which we might expect unifying to show up again in presidential speeches?
Well, the short answer is a different president. Right, I mean that seriously, and I don't think that this president sees that as one of his goals. He speaks to a very particular audience, and he speaks very clearly to that audience. I was on a plane, so I missed his speech this morning, but the State of the Union, for example, was not an effort at unification.
Which it normally is.
Yeah, I mean, normally that's the, because those speeches, if inaugurals set principles by which an administration will govern itself, a State of the Union applies those principles to policy, and then the budget message puts the money behind the policy, right? So there's a sort of logical sequence of those speeches. This State of the Union did not fall into that logical sequence. So I would say that if you're going to get unifying rhetoric, it's going to come from a different president.
There are, throughout our history, there have been moments when people have used rhetoric to create a sense of fear or they've drawn on alienation, create a sense of hatred toward our fellow citizens. But in the larger arc of American history, the counter-argument, the argument that we're moving forward the American dream because of our shared identity. And if you think about all the speeches we talked about tonight, they're all optimistic because they point to our shared humanity. And throughout history, that rhetoric has had much more resonance. Now, that's not where we are right now, but you think of the other times we've come through, the civil rights movement and the hate that seems so silly and stupid now, the time before the Civil War, many, many times, the optimistic message that points to our shared identity has one enormous advantage. which is we all are human beings who want basically the same things for our families and our country. And that's why President Obama, quoting Dr. King, quoting Theodore Parker, said the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And it bends toward justice because of our shared humanity. And that is still true.
I think another precondition, though, for the return of that kind of appeal is to restore the respect for fact. Because what those shared principles have typically been based upon is a set of facts that ultimately are shared.
My colleagues are better historians than I am, so I am just joyful that I can quote John Adams. And he was defending British soldiers in the Boston Massacre, and he said, facts are stubborn things indeed. And I think facts still are stubborn things. If you think about the evolution of attitudes about global warming, it's because facts are stubborn things. And I'd say the same thing on accepting, people of every possible gender, ethnicity. Facts are stubborn things. I admit they seem a little less stubborn now, and David's, as usual, totally right about that.
Other questions? One here?
Yes, I had a question about getting away from the degraded state of our rhetoric, our political rhetoric lately. I wonder if it's possible that we would again have a flourishing of rhetoric with a less secular nation. I'm just sort of struck by the greatest speeches. Some of the greatest speeches are from the 19th century, and they draw very heavily on the Bible, as did Martin Luther King. But I wonder if we've lost that element of our national consciousness.
That's a super good point, because presidents could, FDR, for instance, could refer to a Christian nation in a way that a president now just can't do. To FDR's credit, he actually is one of the presidents that adds Judeo to that, and it was considered like, oh my God, radical. And how do you talk about transcendent values without the deity? It's a good trick. And I think presidents can do it when they do it as Obama did, which is a reference to their personal faith and a reference to the unifying aspects of faith in general. But it's a much more difficult task than it used to be, for sure. Gentlemen, what do you think?
Of course, the reason it was an easier task in the past is that we were much more exclusive and not as inclusionary about what religion and what faiths were assumed of the American population. So that at the same time they were unifying, they also caused a lot of people to feel left out.
There's one other faith system that is available to us, and that's the secular faith system of the American dream and the American experiment. Then Senator Obama titled the race speech "A More Perfect Union," and almost all of his rhetoric is based in the idea, the democratic ideals, and that we gradually move toward a union in which all are included and that we have the four freedoms for all Americans. And it seems to me, I think that's why many of us, when we walk, my wife is here and she can tell you, we were in Washington for a convention and we walked the mall. And I cried twice at the Lincoln Memorial and at the King Memorial, pretty much the whole way through, walking through the FDR
I'm never traveling.
Memorial.
Donna, you're a remarkable woman.
Yeah, she is indeed. I am thankful for her continued bad judgment. But the point is, those secular saints mattered.
Yes.
They stand for something larger. If you can't stand at the Lincoln Memorial and thank God for Abraham Lincoln, but all of us do that. That mythology should be available to all of us. One of the things that threatens us is the decline of faith in the American dream, and we need to reaffirm that, I think.
So somebody wrote to Roosevelt in like, I want to say it's 1934, but I could have the date wrong. And there were rumors that the Roosevelts were secretly Jewish, which was, of course, terrible. And somebody wrote him a letter and said, really? Like, are you secretly Jewish? And Roosevelt did a fairly unusual thing, which is that he published the response in his public papers. And he didn't shame the guy for asking the question, and he didn't say, no, sir, you should be more tolerant. He said, I don't know. You know, in the dim, distant past, they could have been. No idea. I hope they were good citizens and believers in God. And so he models this kind of democratic notion of what it means to be a citizen in an inclusive republic, right? Which is, I don't know, they could have been anything. Doesn't matter. I hope they were good citizens. Right? And so I think that's the promise. I'm locating the promise that you find in actual presidential rhetoric.
Well, can I add to that? There's a moment in Reagan's first inaugural where he takes us on a tour of the mall, and he talks about, because this first inauguration on the west front of the Capitol, and he talks about Washington, a monument to a monumental man, and he takes us to the Jefferson, and he says that the Declaration of Independence flames with his eloquence, and to the Lincoln Memorial, and he talks about whosoever would understand the life of this nation will find it in the life of Abraham Lincoln. But then he takes us across the river to Arlington National Cemetery to the grave of Martin Treptow, and he finds meaning there, because the meaning of this country is in ordinary Americans who've been committed to that American ideal. It's an incredible moment. And we can learn a lot from President Reagan and his faith, both in religion, but also his faith in the ideals of this nation, the world's oldest republic.
Hi. I know we're here to talk about elected presidents. I was wondering if I could ask a question about presidential candidates who wish to be elected. But more to the point, my question is predominantly for Dr. Stuckey, but extended to everyone, of course. But the idea, reading your essay on hyperbole, anger, and hope, the idea of transitional eras of intense political instability that allow for rhetoric such as Trump, among others, to succeed. This is clearly still a transitional era or a political instability going on that both sides of the partisan aisle seem to see, especially with voters right now. What is needed for a successful presidential candidate rhetoric from the Democratic side in order to succeed in this, do you think? This
Well, it ain't what
instability?
happened in Iowa.
Yeah.
Just stipulate that. It's a really good question, because the problem that people face is that when Trump turns politics into a reality show, right, where people are grabbing attention. I mean, one of the things that Pelosi did, right, by ripping the speech was she played by his rules. Now people are talking about me ripping the speech. They're not talking about your speech, right? That's a very Trumpian move. Strategically successful, perhaps? Is that where we want our politics to go? But when they go low, we go high. That didn't turn out so well for the Democrats either. And so it's really a question of finding a space that doesn't necessarily play by Trump's rules, but accepts the fact of those rules, and then devises something, what we would call rhetorical invention, right? Comes up with a response to that changes the nature of the game. None of the Democratic candidates so far, and none of the Republican candidates who have in the past opposed Trump, have been able to solve that riddle.
There's another aspect of the problem that your question raises, which is one of the unintended consequences of the party selection reforms that took place beginning in the late 60s and early 70s, when we went suddenly from 15 primaries to primaries everywhere and multiple contenders, of course, is the dilemma is how do you not trash your opponents so that the dominant impression of the challenging party is one of just infighting and bickering and not really standing for anything, while at the same time making a case for yourself to be ultimately the nominee, so that we produce, it seems to me, year after year in the opposition party, whichever party it is, a situation in which the person who emerges as the candidate has already been substantially weakened by the candidate selection process that the incumbent party will then publicize as a reason not to change parties. And we have to somehow or other figure that out.
Yeah, so, I mean, this next election, political scientists talk about this, about elections as being persuasion elections or mobilization elections. This is not a persuasion election, right? Nobody at this space in our political life, if there's anyone in this audience willing to be persuaded, please let us know who you are, because there just don't seem to be many of those people, right? This is a mobilization election, and so the strategic question is how to mobilize your people, but the question that you're asking is really goes back kind of this question of how do we unite people, how do we come up with a vision of the country that both sides can buy into. And I don't know.
I find this question a little perplexing, and I want to play off both Mary's answer there and her discussion of FDR. For a quarter century after FDR, Democrats talked like FDR, and it worked pretty well. It strikes me that, did you know, in the history of the Democratic Party, Democratic presidents who win 2 consecutive terms with a majority of the vote, so not just 2 consecutive terms, Clinton does that, 2 consecutive terms with a majority of the vote, David will know, but it's well over a century. FDR did it 4 times, Obama did it twice. Wilson did not do it, Cleveland did not do it, only FDR and Obama did it. And did you notice that Obama did it while facing massive prejudice too? So, knowing that, we know Obama mobilizes people. Why don't we talk like Obama? Now, admittedly, that's a high bar to aim at, but so was FDR. We get close to that bar. If I were speaking as a partisan, talk like Obama if you want to mobilize people.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for being here tonight. It's been a great program. I do have a question. You referenced Abraham Lincoln. I found it interesting that you didn't cite the Gettysburg Address. You did cite the second inaugural address. Now, I grew up in Illinois, and land of Lincoln. Lincoln was a hero of mine. And growing up, we all memorized the Gettysburg Address in grade school. Later years, we moved to Washington, D.C. I lived there for a number of years. And one of the first things I did was to walk over to the Lincoln Memorial. And of course, there you have on one side of it the Gettysburg Address, which I read for, I don't know how many times I had read it. I wasn't familiar with the second inaugural. I hadn't heard about it in grade school. I read it. It stopped me in my tracks. So from then on, when people would come to DC and I would take them over to the memorial, I would always make sure they read that they would read both of them. And I can't tell you how many times I visited the memorial. I never failed to read that second inaugural. But anyway, I found it interesting that that is what you cited rather than the more well-known Gettysburg Address.
Well, part of that was just being contrary. Part of it is I do believe the second inaugural is a greater speech, in part because of the issue that it has to wrestle with. But I taught this past fall two-session class on Lincoln's canonical texts. And when I got to and it was an adult audience like this, when I got to the Gettysburg Address, I said, how many of you had to memorize this when you were in grade school? Just about everybody's hand went up. Why do you think you were asked to memorize this speech in grade school? Because it's so short. Now, both of them are short speeches, but if you compare the two, the second inaugural is almost 3 times as long as the Gettysburg Address. But I think it's dealing with a much tougher rhetorical situation and does it more effectively. But I'm very high on the Gettysburg Address. I could have picked both of those texts, but then I was afraid people would think I was only interested in Lincoln.
Golly, David, why would anyone think that?
Please join me. Here we go. Please join me. Are we still? There we go. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Dr. Stuckey, Dr. Rev Ski, and Dr. Rowland. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful discussion.
And thank you.
Yes.
We hope you'll join us next Tuesday for the second installment of the Presidential Lecture Series. We'll have Dr. Craig Smith here to discuss. He's a former speechwriter for President Ford and also President H.W. Bush. And he'll be talking about his book, Confessions of a Presidential Speechwriter. We'll have a book sale and signing. You won't want to miss it. So next Tuesday, February 11th at 7 o'clock. See you then.